The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Imagine living in a world where ghosts, UFOs, time slips, and uncanny synchronicities weren't the stuff of fringe conversation, but everyday realities hiding in plain sight. For more than 3 decades, British researcher, author, and speaker Andy Thomas tracked these patterns, paranormal encounters, cover-ups, and suppressed histories, and asked why mainstream culture resists them so fiercely. In books like The Truth Agenda, Conspiracies, and his latest, Strange, Paranormal Realities in the Everyday World, Andy has gathered countless first-hand testimonies, investigated anomalies from crop circles to phantom time theories, and explored how ridicule and censorship keep humanity from facing the evidence in front of us. This week, on the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Andy shares the 10 books that shaped his search for truth and the unexplained, and opens up about his own journey, from music and folklore to becoming one of the UK's most respected investigators of mysteries, cover-ups, and hidden realities. Andy Thomas, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So you said about your 10 best list that these books came to you at different stages in your life and mostly listed sequentially. So as we go through them, it's going to track your life experience and how they played a role in preparing that path for you. I mean, when did you first start reading these kinds of books?
I mean, I was brought up in a very religious household. So, the world of mysteries in a very Catholic house was all around me. You have to be able to believe in mysteries to accept that kind of faith. So that was all around me. And although that's not my faith today, I don't regret having that. And, my father, was, I think, a very deep thinker when it came to things like that. And both my father and my mother were interested in mysteries enough to have a copy of Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods hanging around the house. And that always fascinated me. And it wasn't really until much later when I became involved in crop circles that that world opened up. But now looking back, I realize actually there were some primers there. And it wasn't entirely strange to me, if you pardon the pun, to begin to think about things beyond the normal. And that's what the paranormal is. That's what it means. And I now, I understand looking back that there was more of an acceptance of that than perhaps I thought there was at the time.
Yeah. Well, you've obviously, as a researcher, you've read many, many, many books. How did you distill the list? What criteria did you use?
I tried to think of books that had come to me at different periods of my life, and more or less in order, that either sort of like reflected where I was then, or then helped to shape me. So it kind of sort of tells the story really where I have got to today, and some of the books perhaps might surprise some people. Perhaps they're not obvious choices, but these are the books that I can look back and can see, absolutely put me where I am today and put me into that mindset of being open-minded instead of closed.
Well, the first one, I think this is the first time it's ever been recommended in 5 years. And it is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, published in 1843. Why this book?
So, I mean, I give talks today about the paranormal and the strange, but some people don't realize I also give talks about history and folklore. One of my talks that keeps me very busy in November and December each year is the history of Christmas and, where it's all come from and whatever your belief system. And I'm totally inclusive. You discover that there's so many interesting layers to it. I realized that one of the reasons that I think I really connected with Christmas and also the supernatural was that when I was young, my father would read me A Christmas Carol in the run up to Christmas every year for a few years. And I mean, people have got used to the story and they think they know it from adaptations. But I have to say, there is no adaptation that comes up to what the book is. And if you've never read the book, I would absolutely recommend to anybody out there that you read it. It's dripping with atmosphere, but it portrays the joy of Christmas and what it really means, and gets under the cover of all the paraphernalia. But it also it imagines that there are realms, there are worlds where other beings can come and go. And Dickens himself, I understand, was quite skeptical, but he understood that using this as a metaphor, if you like, a way of showing people how we should reappreciate what we have with the festivals. It's a very good doorway into it, but it made me very open to considering, well, what if there are other realms out there? I just took it for granted that there must be. And certainly the first sort of like chapters of the book, they're really, I think, the most intense. They are the darkest and the most atmospheric. And they stay with me every Christmas Eve when I get to it. I always imagine that atmosphere, and it stayed with me all these years.
Hmm. Well, book number 2 is another, it's a theme that we've never had before. So I'm really, pleased to see these kinds of books coming forward. Doctor Who and the Daemons by Barry Letts, published in 1974, which you said was a novelization of an early 1970s TV series of Doctor Who.
Indeed so. So again, this might seem like an odd choice. So Doctor Who today is a very different beast to what it was back in the 1970s. I still follow it, but it's a different world. Back when the Doctor was a grey-haired man called John Pertwee, they were very strong stories, and they went through a period of exploring sort of different myths and legends. They covered Atlantis, and this particular book is very well written. Some of the novels are dashed off in later years, but this one is written by the chap that basically, Barry Letts, was the original writer. So he's put in a lot more layers to it. It's about a race of, actually they pronounce it's spelled D-A-E. It looks like demons. It's pronounced demons according to the book, but of course it turns out they've turned up in this village in what is clearly Wiltshire, where I would eventually wind up spending a lot of time investigating crop circles and UFOs. An ancient barrow is opened and it releases this force. And these demons are, of course, in fact, aliens, again, very Von Daniken, but they look like demonic figures. And this is something that then triggers off a whole series of events in this little English village. And there's something about the way it's written that really pulls you in. And, that sort of quaint English life, I knew that very well, and didn't realize when I was reading that book that, the earth mysteries that it's touching into, and talk about, magic, although, of course, it all turns out to be science in the end. That would influence me, and that I would eventually wind up spending quite a lot of time in those very places in my later travels. And I look back and I realize that opened me up to that. Yeah, I mean, it's very entertaining, but it does have something to it that does say, look, there's more than what we see here. And I think, again, those novels, the world of Doctor Who, it makes you look more broadly at the world that you are actually living in. And part of you wants it to be more like that. But then I found out as I grew up that actually it was more like that than perhaps I thought. And that was a really good starting point. And if anybody wants, a kind of a mystery, it's a bit like The Wicker Man, but for family viewing and family reading, this is a good starting point. Certainly it's stayed with me all these years.
There's a number of books that came out around that time that are, set in little isolated English villages, if the English village is not a very good place, to park yourself.
No, well, that's right. It is a thing. And in this particular story, the Doctor's arch enemy, the Master, in his original incarnation, is posing as the vicar, hilariously. So the Master's this very evil sort of man, goes around trying to be ever so nice to people. So that's quite fun as well. Yes, absolutely. It's a quintessential theme that many people were exploring back at that point. And there were many others, but that was the one that reached me.
Yeah. Well, I guess we shouldn't be surprised then that the third book on your list is Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, published in 1954. And you said that this really did influence you greatly as a teenager.
It did. I mean, there's a lot of snobbery around Tolkien, which I find quite annoying. And a lot of academics just sort of sniff at it, but I don't quite understand why. He imagines a world that feels so real that you actually can't believe it isn't. And I know there is a conspiracy theory out there that really it was real and that he somehow found out about it and worked it into fiction, which I don't believe, but I can totally understand why people would feel that. And there's the earlier sort of history of Middle Earth, the Silmarillion. It's also very beautifully written, and it's so dense. It's so just true to life, and what it expresses. It's so beautiful. You can't believe it isn't real. So, but this was a book that came to me actually through my sister Denise, my elder sister, who was a big Tolkien fan, and we would spend a lot of time talking about the book and what was in it, and imagining being in these worlds. There's something about human emotion that Tolkien expresses very well. It might be seen by some as a bit of a dry way, but actually, I think he gets under the skin of what it is to be human, or even an elf or other creatures. But really, as he himself has acknowledged, it's a metaphor for the world. And the Shire is England, and the hobbits are the English people. On one level, it's a satire of that. But on another level, he's thinking, well, what happens when they are placed into a very difficult position? He always said it's not an allegory about the world wars, even though he was involved in World War One as a soldier. He always said, no, it's not, but it is applicable to it if you wish it to be. And you can see it clearly is. And it makes you realize what people have to go through when their very quiet lives are suddenly exposed to a much bigger, darker world. And everybody knows the movies today, and they're very, very good, but they're still not the book. And again, the book has a lot of layers to it which never made it into the movies. And I would certainly recommend trying to sort of de-imagine what you've seen in the films and just take the book in its own right. But it takes you away from, the everyday life and yet reflects it back. It's responsible for a lot. I mean, now we have much harder books like Game of Thrones, and there's a lot of dark fantasy out there. And there's elements to that darkness in there. But what Tolkien was very good at doing, and he was a very religious man, very Catholic man, he puts a lot of light into it. I mean, interestingly, there's no prophets in it. There's no Jesus figures like C.S. Lewis did. It's not like that. It's just woven sort of very deeply underneath that. Which is nice. So it's not in your face. He's not trying to sell you any ideal, and yet somehow you sense that he understands the way the world is and what the human spirit is and the challenges that you will sometimes come across and how you have to deal with them. And it still stands up. And if it didn't stand up today, nobody would be reading it or watching them still, even now. And it's even now there's a whole TV series about the earlier stages of a Middle Earth. So, it's clearly something which does deserve, I think, more respect, certainly than many academics give it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those books that many people remember where they were, what they were doing when they read that book. I mean, it's very clear in my memory. I just had a baby who didn't sleep at night. So I used to spend all my time, walking up and down with him in one arm and the book in the other.
Yeah.
And so every time I think of the book, I think of him.
Perfect. Well, that would have been a very good sort of escape from dealing with difficulties. So yeah, even though the difficulties it portrays again are things that sadly sometimes do happen in the real world.
Book number 4, Childhood's End, Arthur C. Clarke, published in 1953. So tell us about this one.
So this is a book that I think is going to become ever more relevant. So I should point out that it's sort of perhaps coincidence that it also involves creatures coming to Earth that look like demons. So a bit of a Doctor Who connection there, but it's done in a very different way. So cutting a long story short, these creatures show up in great big spaceships, classic, hover above the cities of the world, and effectively, in a very gentle way, they take over. Nobody knows what they look like at first. Many years later, they reveal themselves to be these demonic-looking figures, but it turns out, and I don't want to give too much away, but that us imagining demons is a kind of a psychic echo from the future. where we somehow knew they were going to arrive. And the generation of children that are being born, and it's sort of set in the future, though it was written in the 50s, are becoming telepathic very rapidly. And they will be the next stage of human evolution. Now, back in today's real world, if anybody follows the telepathy tapes, and I'm sure you do, where it's turning out that these children, many of them who are non-verbal and many people thought couldn't even communicate, now with technology, it turns out they can. And it's also turning out they're extremely psychic. And that is anticipated in this book. It's very interesting that these generations start coming through that are so psychic that in the end, they're almost like a different species. And it's very problematic for the parents that suddenly they feel they're losing their children, and yet these children are getting these incredible gifts. And I won't say where it goes because you need to read it, but it is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And if you want the book that really taps into what could happen here and what happens if we were all to become very, very psychic and what the implications of that are, this is the book to read. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke at this point, the author, it's quite interesting. He's very open to the paranormal. And later, of course, he co-wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey with Stanley Kubrick. As he got older, he went more and more away from anything paranormal and more, he had to be hard science. But what's lovely in Childhood's End is that he kind of blends it. He doesn't see a conflict between the two there, which I much prefer. So, yeah, no, there's something very powerful about this book, but I find it so interesting that its message, that what it portrays, might well be coming true sooner than we know. And so I find that I would have chosen it anyway, but I find that a very relevant book. And again, it was a book that opened me up to thinking, well, maybe there are psychic faculties we have. And of course, I would discover later through my work and investigating that was indeed very much the case. So, that was another primer for that way of thinking.
Yeah, very prophetic. So number 5, this is a book that comes up many, many times. In fact, it's probably in our top 20 recommended books every year. Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by Richard Bach, 1977.
So I saw that some of your other guests had chosen it, but I thought, well, I'm not going to delist it because this was so powerful. I mean, I went through a phase when I was in my late teens. I had a back injury and wound up spending a lot of time lying around, being in hospital, having various treatments, very miserable. I'd just begun work shortly before that, then had to have a lot of time off work. And so people were saying, well, listen, I read this, this might help you, or, that might fill some time. And I became aware through reading that was recommended to me by various friends, things that I wouldn't have perhaps come across myself at that stage. And one of them, a lady friend of mine, said, look, you might find this really inspiring. And I'd read Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and that was a lovely book, and that's about individuality and celebrating that. But this, for anybody that doesn't know, it's about a pilot, and the author was a pilot, so he's kind of using his own world there, who meets another pilot who just happens to be a messiah and can perform miracles and has wonderful wisdoms, and he gives him a book full of these kind of beautiful sort of wise sayings. That makes it sound very pious. It isn't. It's full of humor. And, there's a lot of sort of playfulness, banter and whatever between the two characters. And eventually it gets a bit darker as it goes on, as the reality of what being a Messiah would actually mean in this world. And sadly, we see that today with the way that people who are unusual get treated. But it's about, look, this world, as the title might suggest, it's essentially illusions. Now, I took that quite literally at first and, spent time trying to do miracles, which never worked. It's probably just as well. But I realized gradually, okay, the message here is don't take things at face value. There's much more to reality than we think. And when I got that, it's been a book that, I've always sort of celebrated and come back to ever since. There's something about it. You come out of it feeling like very elevated, and it does make you look beyond the normal and makes you understand that, there are certainly, again, like some of the other books, there's layers to reality, there's faculties that we have that perhaps most of us don't tap into. And just the imagining of that world where you can, and through meeting Donald Shimoda, this Messiah figure, Richard Bach in the story, he comes to learn how to do this himself and realizes it's actually not so difficult. And then, absolutely, the message is there. Nothing is blocked to you if you can just learn how to access it and, get into your higher spiritual nature. So it's a beautiful book. It's great fun. I know some people think, it's going to be a bit sort of over spiritual, and it isn't. And that's what I love. It does give you all those messages, but it's done under a very clever sort of storyline, which I'm amazed nobody has ever filmed. I've longed for the day where somebody films this book. It would be very cinematic and all the flying sequences and stuff. But anyway, so there we are. For anybody who's watching, for goodness sake, get the rights to film that book. And I now think, we're coming back to those kinds of beliefs again. It would be a very apt time now for people to rediscover it.
Mm. Well, book number 6 is one that you say really set you on a search for the truth of the paranormal, and of course that's been a long time search. The book is The Crop Circle Enigma, Grounding the Phenomenon in Science, Culture and Metaphysics, edited by Ralph Noyes, photographs by Busty Taylor, published in 1990. So what was it about this book?
So I discovered crop circles in 1991, and that was really my doorway into, exploring the paranormal. I'd heard about them before, but it wasn't until the actual seeing of them and spending time in them that it just opened a doorway in me to, okay, something quite astonishing is going on here, and nobody can really answer it. And then we had all the debunking and so on, but I knew there was something still beyond that. And it, introduced me to people who were looking into other things and other ways of thinking. So for me, the crop circles turned out to be a crucial thing. So this book had just come out just the summer before I got into crop circles, and there weren't that many books about crop circles then. There was an earlier book called Circular Evidence that is also very good, but it was more about the simple earlier crop circles. This one was written by all the upcoming crop circle researchers of the day that had not previously written on crop circles before. And so what's very good about it is it's a compendium of all these different views. And for me, having just come into it, and I bought that book the same week that I discovered crop circles, I was just so absorbed. I was just spending every night staying up to about 1 a.m, having to read it, thinking, oh my goodness, I didn't know about this. And each page I turned, it just made me see the world with different eyes. And nobody knew what was going on back then, and they still don't know what's going on. And it's still a mystery. But what the book did was absolutely give a really good across-the-board overview of where they were at then. And although many things have changed since then, I'm not sure that much, and we still don't know. So, it was a very influential book then in sending me on the pathway that I'm on now.
So what is if you had to throw out a guess, what is your guess?
People always ask me that. Have you got another hour or two to spare? In the end, right, we don't know what makes crop circles. We know some are man-made, but that does not explain all of them. You've got eyewitnesses, people watching them occurring within seconds, biological anomalies in the plants, incredible geometry, and so on and so on. In the end, we can just make observations that some of them do appear in very short periods of time with strange lights and whatever. They're often drawn to underground water, which is interesting. So there seems to be a geological factor. So I think there is a natural element to it. But clearly some of them do display levels of consciousness. They're not random symbols, all of them. Some of them clearly, there's something at the other end of it that knows what it's doing. So I suspect it's a blend of different things. I think there is another consciousness involved. I think there is a natural element involved. Some are made by people. Some say it's all the same thing coming together by different means, and that these symbols are basically archetypal inner symbols that are currently expressing themselves in the world because we need them, because they make people think. They're waking people up just to look at the world with new eyes, whatever they actually mean. And so to me, that's not truly an answer to what you've asked me, but that's good enough justification for them to exist. And maybe one day we'll get a clear answer, but right now, that's what we can do, make observations of what is and see if it gets a little bit clearer later on. But if it doesn't really matter, because it's already, I think, doing what it was meant to do, and it's brought many people to this new awareness of wider things going on in the world. And many of those early researchers went on to look at a lot of other things as well as crop circles and make a difference. And that's certainly been true for me as well. It's sent me on many paths, but that particular book, Crop Circle Enigma, was, I think, for me, the perfect starting point with it. And eventually I would then write my own books, which were influenced, no question, by that book.
Book number 8, Mapping the Millennium, Behind the Plans of the New World Order, by Terry Boardman, 1999. And this is probably the one that most people will be interested in, because as you say, that the further that you delved into the unexplained, the more you found yourself confronted with beliefs in full-blown conspiracies. One of them being, 9/11, which you say, it's not a conspiracy theory.
Well, we'll come to 9/11 in a minute, because it appertains
that the
better,
next one?
perhaps, to
That's
the
the
next
next
book.
one.
But it
Okay.
doesn't matter. It's
So
interlinked.
they follow on from one another. Yeah.
They do. So the New World Order it's a bit of a catch-all term, but it is based on a real project that got set up mainly in the early 20th century. But the tendrils go back earlier than that. The New World Order that most people refer to is basically a plot of Western hegemony, really, of trying to sort of keep the world under Western hands. Now, some would add into that the Chinese and the Russians are all secretly working together. I'm not so sure about that. Personally, I think the original New World Order is much more about, a Western plot to keep dominance. But the thing is, there's so much conspiracy stuff out there where there's a lot of kind of shouting and empty speculation. What is so wonderful about this book is that it actually gives you the history. Terry Boardman, I mean, he is a Rudolf Steiner scholar, so he's a very spiritual person, but he's also very concerned about the control agendas in the world, as Rudolf Steiner was, and he spoke about that very often. Terry is one of my favorite speakers. I mean, Terry Boardman's talks I find so inspirational. They're so packed with detail and layers of information in one talk. I mean, it's hard to take it all in, but at the end of it, you've had an incredible experience. And although he hasn't written many books, this book is the book that I would recommend to anybody that wants a true grounding in what the real New World Order is and how it began. And he explains the characters who were involved and people like, Arthur Balfour and Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Cecil Rhodes, all these kind of early sort of powerful people in the world and these colonial sort of figures started to put this idea together of, keeping the world under their umbrella, really. And later on, people like H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell would take it on. They would all openly speak of creating the New World Order. And I mean, H.G. Wells even wrote a book called that. So it's not something hidden. I know some people say it's just a conspiracy theory. Well, it isn't. What Terry does so well is get down to the detail without any sensationalism of, well, here's where it began. And his scholarship, his level of knowledge is so impressive that I just cannot see how you can really argue with the way he traces how it built up. So there's nothing wrong with speculation, and some conspiracy theory, as we know, has a ground, that does need looking at. But sometimes people do it without really knowing the detail. This book needs to be read and understood, and you can see where it all began and where it might go. And it's interesting because quite early on, you see that there was a choice to demonize Russia very, very early on, which of course then has created the very kind of Russia that we are now having to deal with. But it's almost like that was a given. We almost helped create that situation. And it was always of the belief of the early New World Order people that it must never be allowed to have any power in the world. But of course, that set up all these conflicts that have followed. And some would say that is deliberate, but others would say maybe that wasn't what they intended, but that's what they got. So it's really fascinating. It shows you how we got to where we are today, but in a very intelligent way. And it doesn't shout anything at you. It just tells you what you need to know. And that is what Terry is very, very good at doing.
Well, then the one that goes into the conspiracy theories is book 9, The New Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions about the Bush administration and 9/11 by David Ray Griffin, published in 2004.
So this is an area now where, thanks to the mainstream media having demonized anybody that questions it, that you can barely talk about in the mainstream anymore. There was a time where there was a very open 9/11 truth movement, and I was a part of that. And there were calls even by public figures for inquiries, and that's all got buried now. And where we've had some more, shall we say, extraordinary conspiracy theories, and a lot of it's all got very right wing and that's enabled the mainstream media to shut down any talk about 9/11, which definitely needs talking about, because the facts of what actually happened, as opposed to what we are told happened and revisionist mainstream coverage of it, they're a world apart. There are so many unanswered questions. It is very clear that that event was at the very least helped along or allowed to occur when you look at the evidence. Now, you say that to people today and they go, how can you say that? Well, you can say that because it's in plain sight. It is absolutely clear. And David Ray Griffin was one of the, sadly departed now, but he was one of the best of the 9/11 researchers. He was a Christian academic. So a man who had a long sort of years of respect behind him. And he said, I've got to question this. You cannot not address this. He was very brave. And that was the first of a number of books that he's written about it. I would recommend people read all of them. But you just get to the end of this one, and then there's been updated versions of it over the years. And you realize we have not been told the truth. And again, like Terry Boardman, David Ray Griffin does it without any sensationalism. He was a big influence on me when I started to write about conspiracies as to how to do it. So no shouting, no shaking the fist, you must believe this, and showing clear evidence. If you're going to make a statement, you've got to have evidence to back that statement up. And he does. And he just delivers it in a very calm way and says, this needs looking at, because here's the evidence for this. Here it is. There are the references. Now what do we do about it? And he doesn't try to say, right, it was that person over there who did everything, or that group over there. But he says, what that person says there doesn't make sense. It is contradicted by what that person there says. Shall we look at this? And you can't argue with the way he does it. And you just get to the end of that book and the later books that he then went to write, and you just say, this absolutely needs to be looked at again. And how it's been allowed to be buried is a big sin, I think, of the modern world. And the point I'm making here is, though, that he does this. He makes you look at it without having to do anything that is wrong. He just shows you the facts of it, and as set against the clear lies, or what he would later call omissions and distortions of the official investigations. So this is that if anybody wants to read about 9/11 but doesn't want a big shouty book telling you it was all done by aliens or whatever, right? Forget all those, read this book and the later books, and the case is watertight. And it's a very sad reality that he didn't live to see this go anywhere. Maybe it never will go anywhere, but his writings, his investigations are still there. It's in the record, and you can only hope that one day somebody will unearth this and say, why wasn't this addressed at the time? So, yeah, the new Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin is your starting point. And by the way, just should anybody not understand the reference, the new Pearl Harbor was a phrase that was used in a document for a group called the Project for the New American Century about a year before 9/11, saying that American power would not grow properly without a new Pearl Harbor, i.e. some new crisis point to trigger them having more influence in the world. And wasn't it interesting that just after 9/11 occurred, George W. Bush immediately said, this is the new Pearl Harbor. And if you look back, it looks like it was anticipated and planned for a long time. It doesn't entirely tell you who did what, but it certainly, sadly, raises deep suspicions.
I remember at the time, or after, the early years after, there was talk of a document that was going around that had been signed by hundreds of architects who all said, the same thing, that architecturally those buildings could not have gone down the way they did without some help.
Yeah, the physics of the collapses of the towers really don't make sense. We're told they do, but they only do if you omit a lot of important information, and that's how the mainstream works. Yeah, I mean, anybody that wants to know more about that, I would strongly advise going to the website of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. So Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth are not conspiracy theorists, though they are branded as such now. They are what they are. They are professionals who look at what happened on 9/11 and say, this does not make sense, and here is why. Very credible again. And David Ray Griffin was, very much involved with people like that. And Richard Gage, who's a big part of that. People that know their stuff. And that's the shocking thing, that the people in those professions can still be ignored today and ridiculed today, and that is not right.
And the other sad thing is that there are so many people who so do not want their ideology, laughed at.
No. Well, I mean, we're all used to being laughed at, of course, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, so many people cling to it because, oh no, the authorities couldn't possibly, that wouldn't happen. That doesn't happen. That's beyond the pale.
Well, sadly, when you look back at history, and in my own books about conspiracies, I talk about this, there are now very obvious events where large numbers of people were sacrificed in the name of an agenda, and somebody clearly thought it was worth doing. So to say they couldn't have done that with 9/11 actually doesn't fit the pattern of history, which is very depressing, I know. But there is a strong case that 9/11 needs to be completely reinvestigated. Maybe one day it will, but it looks at the moment, a bit like Kennedy, really, that they're hoping enough time's gone by, they can just keep reinforcing the official view until people forget it. But you have to hope, maybe in a world of AI that begins to actually break out of its boundaries and looks at things anew, maybe it might come to all this information. And one of the best sources will be the new Pearl Harbor and its sequels, and it will go, well, it makes no sense that nobody talked about this at the time. And so hopefully maybe one day that situation will change.
Well, book number 10, completely different book, and again regularly in our top 20. It is The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, published in 1923. So it's a nice book to end on.
It is. Well, this is the spiritual book club. And to me, all of the books I've talked about today are spiritual in their own way. They all touch into it and have all led me to be where I am. But this was a book that has somehow punctuated my adult life. And if anybody doesn't know, it's a parable. It's a story about a prophet, as the name might suggest, coming to a village, and he's heading off on a voyage, and the villagers say, look, please just give us your wisdom before you go so we can remember it. And he does, and they ask him questions. What about people? What about life and death? And and he comes up with these responses. And what I feel about it is they are so profound, they are so true, they are so beautiful. Why do we have a world full of religious texts that cause division when you could put all of them aside and just have the prophet? If everybody lived by what is in the prophet, we would live in a totally different, beautiful world. And I don't understand why that is not the book that is recommended rather than anything else when you want a spiritual text. And it's non-denominational. You can be of any religion and get something wonderful from it. You can only think that when Gibran was writing this, that he was literally divinely inspired. I mean, as much as any other religious text. I mean, where this came from, we can only imagine. He was an American Lebanese, so he had a sort of a mixed background. But just something that comes through is so true. And every other line you read, it's like, yes, that's the truth, isn't it? And you kind of know it, like all great truths. You know it already in your heart. But when somebody expresses it just spot on, you go, yes. And The Prophet is that book. It's not a long book. And there was a sequel, which is also very good, called The Garden of the Prophet. But yeah, I mean, everybody should carry a copy around, I think, and just always just open it up at times when you need some advice or you're despairing. You read it and you go, oh, yeah. And it makes sense of things. And it's very honest. I mean, like, for instance, one of the famous bits is, look, when things go wrong in your life, you are not blameless. This is your karma. Doesn't mean you're to blame, but you're inextricably linked up with it. Own that. Live with that and work your way forward. Don't always be a victim to it. There's things like that where some people say, no, that wasn't anything to do with me. But he makes you see it in a very spiritual, karmic way, which is, well, maybe yes. The world around us, we create a bit like illusions. So Richard Bach says that the world around us, we basically self-create it. And isn't it interesting that now, in a world of quantum physics, which is beginning to expand and look at the implications, is effectively saying consciousness might well be the underlying factor in the universe, not anything else. We've been fed materialism for so long. But what if it's what we all create inside of ourselves that ultimately dictates it? That's going to change everything. And I think, people like Richard Bach and Gibran, they just knew that innately, and it's the perfect expression of it.
I'm encouraged because, nearly every day now I see something on my newsfeed, about consciousness and some of the latest findings, if you like, about consciousness. And there was one just a few days ago, which really made me smile, referencing back to what we were saying about the telepathy tapes. And it said that scientists are now beginning to believe that autism is an evolutionary thing, which I've been saying since 2003. This is an evolutionary leap that humanity
It would seem so.
Yeah.
It would seem so. Now, there's one book that we haven't mentioned today, which really actually makes up the 10 that I got to mention, which is Paul Bura's book, Job, Servant of Gaia.
Oh, I skipped it.
Which we skipped, but that's all right, because this is the perfect time to talk about it. So again, it is full of great wisdom. Paul Bura was a channeler and a great friend of mine, again, sadly departed now, this world. But he was a big influence on me. I met him when researching crop circles in my quite early days, and he was coming at it from a spiritual angle. He was trying to see what could mediums discover about crop circles, and we went out into the fields and we did all these experiments and so on. But he had his guide. There's many channel guides. His was a man called Job, Joe, as in Joeb, Job, but it was pronounced Job. And we would sit there in these medium sessions and have chats with Job. And it was a very different character to Paul, even though it was clearly coming through him. And you would just interact with this character. And look, I don't know where it was coming from, but you just took it for what it was. And he would come back with these really fascinating insights. And so Job, Servant of Gaia, Paul said, I want to somehow put this down somewhere. And it turned out to be the first proper book that I've been involved with. I've been involved with laying out a book earlier, but in terms of editing it and putting it together, it just purely came about because it was, I'll help you do that. And other members of the circle, as it were, got involved. It's a beautiful little book of wisdom. It's not a long book. It's just, again, vignettes of what we heard from Job in those years. And when I look back at it today, two things really strike me. Number one, what he was talking about then, and signs in the sky and increased what we would now call UFO activity, well, that's actually happening. We actually are now living in that world. Number two, there's a lot of talk about big change coming up, and there's prophecies of something big around the corner. That was being tapped into even in the 1990s, which is when we were involved with Paul. And it's quite prescient because now we actually seem to see it coming true. And maybe it took a bit longer than some people thought it would. But, that interaction with Paul and putting that book together, that was really my starting point with it. And of course, it taught me how to construct a book and put a book together, even though I wasn't writing it. And I've gone on to write 15 books of my own in the years since. So that was a special book for me. So it's not a widely read book, but it's out there somewhere. And it tapped me into, again, where I am today, as all these books did. And I celebrate them all. And I'm grateful to all of the authors and all of those books that they've helped to bring me where I am today.
Well, that's your list. And while we've got you here, I want to talk about some of your own work, your discoveries, your books, etc. Strange is your latest book. Just tell us a little bit about that one.
So I've been working for years with people investigating all kinds of the paranormal, but I've also been giving talks to a lot of community groups. So I meet people, just normal people, not people into the paranormal even, just everyday folk. And because I stand up on a stage and talk about these kind of areas, they'll come up and share things with me that they often wouldn't share with anybody else. So I've heard so many tales of ghosts, of poltergeists, of out-of-body experiences, of UFOs, the bizarrest happenings, psychic phenomena of all kinds. I've had it over and over. And it was only a few years ago I thought, I should be writing this down or getting people to write it down for me. And so I began to do that, and I began to keep records of these incredible stories. And then you would see repeating patterns, and you think, well, this is happening to lots of different people. And that's so encouraging to tell people that, because they often feel alone. They often feel like they can't really share it, or that they'll be ridiculed and that they've gone mad. And you say, no, you haven't, because look, there's all these people over here that are having exactly the same things. So Strange, which is subtitled Paranormal Realities in the Everyday World, it brings all of that together to make the point this isn't actually that strange after all. There's a kind of an irony in the title. It's going on everywhere to somebody somewhere, and you are not alone. And by getting people to have shared their stories in there, but also analysing it, looking at what this means, what the broader meaning of all this is, the hope is it will encourage other people to speak out. Because all the time we just keep this hidden and we don't dare to talk about it. Again, we're stuck constantly in that materialism sort of trap where we're not allowed to think outside of that, even though that isn't the world we live in. And this says, right, here's the real world we're living in. Whatever you think causes it, this is actually happening, and it cannot all be delusion or hallucination. Yes, some, but not all. I'm really hoping, and the feedback that I'm getting from the book is that it is doing exactly that. They're going, wow, it's not just me. Fantastic. And maybe now I'll go and chat to somebody about it. And that's the point. If everybody with these experiences reaches out, we will discover that actually, this was always a big thing all along. And so Strange, yeah, it explores many aspects of the paranormal in a way that I hope takes things forward. I hope so.
We're talking about aspects of the paranormal, time slips and precognition. I mean, they appear repeatedly in your research. Do you see them as kind of isolated glitches, or hints that time is more fluid than we imagine?
So one of the things that the Strange book does as it goes through, so it seems at first there's disparate areas of the paranormal which I explore, but then you begin to see it come together, and you gradually realize that actually they're not disparate at all. They're all part of the same thing, which is that time and space doesn't work the way we think it does. It's wobbly, it's leaky, things come and go. It's not an absolute. And we now know, again, from quantum research, particles can go backwards and forwards in time. One particle can be coexisting in two places at the same time, and nobody thinks that's odd. Particles are connected, even though they're millions of miles away from each other, through no visible means. This basically tells us what mysticism has known for years, which is, because everything is connected by means beyond the material. There is something there that we should all be acknowledging, and it's just been hidden and denied for so long by reductionists who have had a vested interest in keeping us small and narrow. And of course, the more small and narrow we are, the more controllable we are. The more we expand beyond that and say, no, we are more than this. We are going to, I think, find a whole new evolution of the human race, a bit like the Childhood's End book. It's like that is what happens. Suddenly it's like, hang on, we are expanding suddenly, and the universe isn't what we thought it was. And that's the reality. That's the reality of the world that we live in. And I hope that one day soon there will be an official acknowledgement of that, and that we all start to learn to speak openly about this now and see the paranormal not as some aberration, but as almost like an obvious result of the world that we live in. You're always going to get strange things because it's full of holes and things come and go.
Well, over the last, 2-3 decades, I mean, we've seen so many topics, more people coming forward. Yes, I've had NDEs. Yes, I've seen ghosts. Yes, these kinds of phenomena have happened to me. Do you think that the fact that, this seems to be escalating. Is that because people are less likely to laugh at it now, or is there something else that is, kind of making it more available to more people?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at paranormal phenomena, it does seem to be on the increase. And I think since the development of social media, for all the ills of social media that we endlessly hear about, it's also enabled people to express things that mainstream media was never going to give proper room to. Or if it does, it puts the spooky angle on it instead of saying, hey, this is actually a really beautiful, normal thing. Let's have a look at that. Social media has enabled groups to come together where they know they won't be ridiculed, where they can share an experience or something. So I think that's made a big difference. And isn't it interesting that the more they try to put the materialistic lid on, the more people actually seem to be getting interested in these other things? I mean, maybe that's just a typical sort of polarity of these times, or like even astrology, there is actually a growing interest in it. Scientists thought they destroyed that long ago, but because it actually works, whatever reason you think, why, right? People are saying, well, it does work. So I'm actually going to look at that if you don't mind. So I think there's a battle that's been going on for reality for a long while. And I think the reductionists are now losing it. I think that's why they are getting a bit desperate. But because there are so many other channels of information now beyond the narrow mainstream confines, you can't really hold it down anymore. And that's been the same with so-called conspiracy thinking and those other areas. People are able to voice things they were not given a conduit for before. They're going to, and it doesn't mean they're always right, and we know there can be problems with that, but equally, people are entitled to a view, and they are entitled, if they do it in a reasonable way, to express those views. And that's the reality of spirituality and the paranormal. We should note here, it's coming back to Terry Boardman and Rudolf Steiner. Steiner said 100 years ago in his speeches, there will come a time where they will try to trap you, they will lock you in materialism, and that we will be cut off from our higher nature by those that gain power from doing that. He saw that coming, and here we are. But so there's a resistance against that, and I think there's now a realization. And we're living in a country here in the UK where they want to sort of have digital IDs, where soon you're not going to be able to get into your bank account without it. This is a frightening world we're moving into, but people are beginning to say, is that really the way it has to be? And I think we're going to see more and more resistance to that way of thinking. And I think we're going to understand at the other end of it that perhaps there is some new evolution of the human soul that could and should expand, and that we don't have to be constantly boxed in. And that's what's happening at the moment. But the more you get boxed in, the more you want to fight your way out of it, don't you? And I think that's where we're at today.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think we're going to see some really interesting things. And, UFO awareness is another one that, they're talking about it in Congress now. That will go somewhere. You can't keep the lid on that forever.
I was going to ask you about that. I mean, do you think, all the declassification and the public, discussion about it now, many, credible people coming forward talking about it. Do you think that is happening because it's time for us to know the truth? Do you think there is a program of slowly preparing us, for this knowledge that we're not alone in the universe? Which do you think it is? Because, or are they doing it because they have to release it?
Well, there's a thought. I think it's a bit of all of that. I think there is a push now from people that have seen enough evidence that there clearly is some kind of intervention from elsewhere happening in this world now, that just think we can't sit on that. The whistleblowers, some of them are very credible. A lot of military people are coming forward. There's, people in Congress like Tim Burchett, who's very high up the ladder, who's openly talking about things you would never have imagined a politician like that would have talked about. So you've got the element of some people have seen things or seen evidence that they just feel they cannot sit on anymore. They're given a hard time for it, by the way, because there are factions, I think, within the deeper layers of government around the world, but especially in the US, because that's where a lot of the talk about disclosure is now coming from, where I think they're desperate to keep it down because the benefits that you can have militarily and especially economically from getting this new technology that, these craft that are flying around seem to employ, you want it first. You don't want to give it away too soon. I think there's that element too. But there's also, I believe, an element of if we were to learn the truth about what these things are and why they're here, it might be an awful lot to take on board. And a lot of people might panic. The authorities might be concerned they would lose control. Because the day you admit there is a higher power just hovering up there somewhere, why are you going to talk to this lot down here when them up there clearly have got a lot more influence than perhaps we knew? And it will undermine the way people see their governments. And we're already not terribly enthusiastic about them. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on there. But I think also, again, because we have the means to share this now in a way that we didn't 40 years ago, you can't really just keep saying nothing is going on. There's so many encounters with what appear to be aliens and UFOs. And I think it's not as straightforward as it sounds. Some of it comes from psychic realms and other dimensions, as well as just physical places. But it's just now so, I think, overt. You cannot just keep saying nothing is happening. And that's why I think something will have to give sooner or later.
I remember reading about a year ago that NASA had put together a panel of religious leaders, different faiths, because they wanted to ask their opinion about how best to release information like this, for different religious factions, in a way that is not going to frighten people. Now, if they're already making moves like that, then clearly, it started.
For sure. I mean, you could argue that would be silly not to do it, but yeah, it does make you wonder why now. I think one of the problems we have is that different groups are going to react differently, and there will be some religions that will be absolutely threatened by it. You don't believe in aliens or anything that seems to be alien, they believe is demonic. There's a big line of thinking amongst some evangelicals about that. So if aliens are announced, some people will see it as a demonic plot. They won't really believe they are even alien. The conspiracy theorists will think it's a double bluff and that we shouldn't believe anything that any level of disclosure appears to say. I always said that the day after disclosure, should there ever be any official announcement, is going to be one of great confusion. It won't be suddenly an enlightened world. We'll all go, oh, right, that's what's going on. You're going to have incredible battles for what the truth of that is. And I think it would be extremely uncomfortable. And it will mean also that authorities will have to then say, all right, yeah, we have been lying about this for a long time. And the day you do that, we're all going to go, well, what else have you been lying about then? I mean, in his book, just going back to The New Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin, and he has expressed over the years, before, though, we do try and expose something like 9/11, we also need to consider what that will do to the psyche of a population. Because knowing that that happened and that people you thought you could trust had allowed or caused that to happen, that is going to be a big upheaval. And he's right. And he always said we need to think long and hard about that. And I think it is the same with UFO disclosure. So, yeah, anybody that might be a part of that, whether it be NASA or whoever, would do very, very well to be careful with the stages they go through. And I mean, there is talk, there have been allegedly leaked documents that show a program of slow disclosure, admitting a little bit more, building us up, maybe like we are now being built up, until one day they say it. But there's a fear in the UFO community, especially, that there might be a day where you get what they call catastrophic disclosure, where actually it all just comes out in one day because whatever, them up there didn't want to wait anymore, or somebody in a very high level just leaks something and releases something that wasn't ready to go. And we all go, oh my goodness, because we're not ready for it. So that could still happen. And then that could be a rather damaging way of doing it. But if they are doing it in a very slow, controlled way, there is a risk element, therefore, to that happening. Because how long do you keep that slow process going before something decides, oh, enough of this, let's just go for it? And that could happen. So, but either way, we would do very well to psych up to the reality, perhaps, that the universe is indeed strange and not what we thought it was.
Mm. So, final question. Steve Jobs famously gave all the attendees at his memorial service a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi. What book would you want to give to the people who attend your memorial service?
Have I got to choose one?
Yes, just one.
Okay. I think I would, therefore, not that I sit there reading it every day, you understand, but I think just because of the sheer wisdom and common sense that's in it, I would go for Gibran's The Prophet. I couldn't think of any better, but that should be read in every school and every institution around the world today. And it would bring a lot more happiness and peace and joy than many other sacred texts have done. So yeah, let's go for The Prophet. It might seem a bit cliched, but like all good cliches, there's a reason why it's a cliche. That's because there's a truth to it. And that isn't itself a cliche, of course, to say that, but I don't care. So yeah, The Prophet, that's the one, I think, above all.
Yeah, I think that's a great choice. I mean, for me, it's better than any Bible. Yeah. So, Andy Thomas, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list of most inspirational books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. So I have a little something that I want to say to our viewers. Listening to Andy, looking at his work, it's very clear that his work isn't really about chasing anomalies. It's about expanding the lens through which we see reality. Every mystery he's investigated, from crop circles to time slips, suggests that consciousness and the physical world are in constant dialogue, and we've only been hearing one side of it. Like The Prophet, his final book choice, and his lifelong search reminds us that truth rarely announces itself with spectacle. It whispers, waiting for us to look closer, think deeper, and question what we've been taught to dismiss. So maybe the real mystery isn't whether these phenomena are real, but whether we're finally ready to widen our perception and redefine what real truly means. So I'll leave you with this one thought. If truth really hides in plain sight, maybe the question isn't what's out there, but what part of us still refuses to see it. Andy Thomas's latest book, Strange Paranormal Realities in the Everyday World, is published by Watkins, and you can learn more about Andy's research, books, events, and revelations of cover-ups at his website, truthagenda.org. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. Thanks for joining me and Andy Thomas on another 10 Best journey. I'll be back soon with more insights and inspiration from the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Until then, stay curious and keep that No BS discernment meter switched on.
If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you'll love our other shows. The Synergy Sessions, where leading-edge thinkers collide in bold, unscripted dialogues that ignite new possibilities between realms and reason, where we journey into the mysterious consciousness, energy, and the hidden layers of reality, where science converges with spirit in ways you've never imagined. And the No BS Spiritual Book Club, where leading-edge new thought speakers, teachers, authors, and luminaries who've walked this path before you share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on their life journey. All 3 shows are available on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and all major podcast platforms. For more information, visit sedgbeer.com. That's SEDGBEER.com.